Yep. OK. Please interrupt with questions, ideas. Maybe we can get some discussion going. Maybe we'll be able to leave with some ideas for discussion. I'm going to skip over some of the more technically difficult things and just try to get some of the ideas across in terms of issues that come up when we're dealing with privacy and machine learning. OK, so let's see if there. Sensitive data, there's a lot of sensitive data being collected about people. And it really puts personal privacy at risk. I mean, if you talk to Mark Zuckerman, hey, privacy's gone, and you shouldn't worry about it. Well, people are concerned. And some of the problems here, we have so much data collection going on. And being retained, it's uncertain how it's being protected. Whoa, what's going on here? The outcome is we have these privacy breaches, unintentional disclosure of data, your data getting used in ways you don't expect, and what do we do about it? Well, what this has led to is technology being placed at risk. Protests over a national registry in Japan, not a place we normally think as a hotbed of protest, and yet there were street protests over a national registry. The Data Mining Moratorium Act some years ago would have banned all data mining by the US Department of Defense, including research support. I don't know how many of you are supported by Department of Defense grants, but there was an attempt, this was voted on in the Senate to ban data mining. And it hasn't stopped. There are some bans in place, luckily not bans that affect research to a great extent. Legal issues that control what you can do with data. So, but data mining, this gives us these summary results, clusters, classifiers. Does this violate privacy? The fact that we've discovered a cluster, does that really hurt anybody's individual privacy? Well, I claim the answer is, for the most part, it doesn't. Data mining gives us these summaries of the data, and the summaries aren't private. It can be a solution to the problem. It can, done right, we can enable safe use of private data. So where's the problem? Is it the summaries, or is it the generating them that raises the issues? Well, I claim a lot of the time it's how we generate those summaries that really causes the problem. There's a possible exception, anomaly or outlier detection. Well, that's really finding data about individuals or making predictions about individuals. That's potentially an issue. OK, so what are the problems? Well, it isn't data mining. It's the infrastructure to support it. The protests in Japan was moving data to a national registry from local registries. Total Information Awareness Program. They weren't going to generate new data. They were just going to make it much more widely available. Make it information that was held by one agency was going to be available to others. It's this loss of separation of control. It used to be, in order to get this, before the TIA program, which got killed, by the way, if I wanted to get access to this complete profile about an individual, I had to get credentials allowing me to access the FBI's systems and the CIA's systems and the NSA's systems. And as soon as somebody tries to get that level of access, somebody's going to figure it out and stop them. Well, now all I have to do is go get a job with TIA, and I have this whole profile. It just makes getting that access to a wealth of information so much easier. And this is a lot of where I think the real risk is. It's putting this data together. And we'll see that there's some solutions to that. Basically, can we find the patterns without seeing all the data? Can we do our machine learning without actually having access to the data we're supposed to be learning from? Now, at first glance, that sounds impossible. But as we'll see, it can be done. And this opens up a lot of new opportunities. OK, so a little bit on privacy. What's privacy about? Well, ability to access and control one's personal information. That's one definition. Several treaties, law that deals with this. Probably the two most famous here in the US, HIPAA, the Healthcare Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Nothing in the title. Everybody assumes the P is about privacy because you hear about that. But it has nothing to do, the title doesn't include privacy. But one small part of this act gives some fairly well-defined rules on use of healthcare information in the US. The European Community Directive is much broader, much less clearly defined, but encompasses all private data, all data about you as an individual. Now, there's some interesting things here when it comes to privacy. First, it's about individually identifiable data. All these laws say if data can't be traced to an individual, it's not covered. It's not protected. So that's one question, is what is individually identifiable data? Also, notion is highly context dependent. One simple idea might be, well, if you own the data, that you have the right to control that. That's something that people often assume about data. Except, who owns data that's about you? Do you own it? You go into a doctor, and they write a bunch of notes about you. Do you own that data? Well, the doctor would claim they own, yeah.
When you say you own it, does that mean you can sell it, or you can tell somebody else not to sell it?
That's an interesting question. What can you do with it? And that's where this is a problem. Traditionally, we have thought of ownership of data as giving you basically complete rights to it. Well, and who owns data? If you write something, who owns what you write? Who knows copyright law? By default, you write something, you own it. So that means as far as that doctor's concerned, they own those doctor's notes. They have the right to do things with it. Privacy says, even though you don't own it, if it's about you, you have some rights to control what's done with it. So what it really comes down to is privacy is the individual right to choose what is done with your personal information. And this is something that is to some extent new with respect to legal framework. It just hasn't arisen to a great extent. We may talk about that later depending on how time goes. But what I'd like to start out with, first a quick example. First, people think, OK, privacy settings. And this is Mark Zuckerberg's approach with Facebook. Oh, we've got these privacy settings that allow you to control what's done with your privacy information that protects you. Well, it turns out that's not good enough. So here's an example. Suppose I publish myself, and I've got a couple of keywords out there on my Facebook page. And I say, oh, I'm a Republican. Well, being in a university, I may not want people to know that I'm a red stater. So suppose I turn around and I get rid of being a Republican. Well, knowing that I watch Fox News and seeing that I've said something about Bush may allow people to determine I'm a red stater. That's machine learning. Well, using my privacy settings, I may have to go a little bit further than just saying, don't show my political affiliation. I may actually have to control the information I release about myself. So you got to be careful what you disclose in order to ensure that the people who are using machine learning techniques can't learn things about you don't wish to disclose. So this is a first challenge, and one that is still very open. How do you control the ability of someone to learn things about you? And it's even harder than that. Because even without publishing anything about me, from my friendships, you can infer things about others. And from what you infer about others, you can infer things about me. Professor Neville will be talking about the sort of machine learning techniques you use to accomplish learning tasks like this. So, what's the solution? Be careful what your friends disclose? Well, that doesn't sound right. Limit your friends. Well, somehow that doesn't sound right either. Now, what we really need to do is we need to control who sees what. We shouldn't be able to see things that enable inferring information that's hidden. And now this gets to be a big challenge and one that is unsolved. This is an open research opportunity. There's been a few things done, but there's a lot left to do. OK, so now that we've seen how hard this can be, let's talk about some of what comes into this and some of what we can do. OK, first, some of the things that we need to understand with respect to data privacy is understanding the data we have. Often within machine learning, we think of data as being a table where a row in that table is the complete information you have about a single individual. This is the simplest model. And that each individual is independent. Well, then there's relational data, like the social network example I gave. Transactional data where it's hard to think of as a single row. How many items have I purchased? What items have I purchased? So all these kinds of different views of data, and that affect how we have to talk about what is private. What does the adversary know? Do they know things beyond what's in that data? So, as we'll see later on, maybe I don't tell the adversary my name or my address, but I tell them enough about me that they can link it up with the Purdue directory and find out my name and address. What is sensitive? Medical history, salary, GPA. How many of you would think salary information is sensitive and you wouldn't want to reveal it? I see about half the hands go up. How many of the people who didn't put their hands up work for a public university? Your salary information isn't sensitive. You know it. Your salary information is a matter of public record. And you've gotten used to this fact. So it varies. What's sensitive can vary. What's the risk of disclosure? Discrimination, public humiliation, court suits. And who is that risk to? Is it the person the data is about? Is it the person who owns the data? All these are parameters that affect what we do with the data and how we protect it. Okay, so some of the classes of solutions, machine learning, data obfuscation. The idea behind data obfuscation is the people doing the machine learning don't see the real data. They see some noisy variant of the data, and you still learn from it. So this protects privacy because you're not seeing the actual data about individuals. Summarization. Well, we don't reveal all the data, we just reveal some sort of a summary which enables us to do our learning. Or data separation. Somebody's got the data, they never share it, but they participate in the process of learning from it, of developing these models, clusters, the prediction models. So I'm going to just go through a quick example of some of these. So let's assume we have an outlier detection problem. And we're going to assume that we have two types of data. We've got bank information. Now let's back up a little. We've got bank information. We've got credit card information. And, oops, my leash is holding me back here. So we've got bank information and credit card information. And some government agency has developed an algorithm that taking bank information and credit card information is going to tell us if someone is supporting terrorism. Well, all well and good, but they would like to test this. They'd like to find out, does this thing really work very well? Well, how have they done this? Well, what this does is this gives them a region in the space where they view people in that region are funding terrorism. So we'll think of this as a multidimensional space, and that region they've decided are likely terrorists. And they want to find out how many people are really in that region. Well, they've got some known terrorist that's in that region. But are all these other people in that region or not? All they'd like to do is, take the data and look at it and say, are these people in the region? So one approach would be, let's give the algorithm to the banks and the credit card agencies. Why is that a bad idea? To give them the model.
They can learn how to get around it.
Right. If you reveal this model, then the terrorists can get that algorithm from the banks and credit card agencies can get that algorithm from the banks and the credit card agencies and use that information in order to figure out how to keep themselves outside that space, so it's no longer useful. So they don't want to give it away. Okay, well, next approach is just expose the data. Well, why is this a bad idea? Well, if I'm one of those people who showed up in there, there's two options. One option is they look at this and they say, oh, our algorithm must be bad because these people probably aren't terrorists. Another option is to say, we really think our algorithm's great. These two people might be terrorists. Let's investigate them. I'm not going to be happy with the bank and credit card agency that gave the data away that enabled them to do this. Or even if they don't say that, hey, here's the data about my neighbor. How are they doing financially? Well, that's probably not something I want known either. Okay, so what we do instead, let's use privacy-preserving data mining techniques to solve this. So one approach is randomization. The idea behind randomization is we move all that data around, but we develop an algorithm that essentially gives us the same results and tells us, because our goal is to say how many people are in that circle without knowing who they are. Is it just Tom Terrace, or is it a whole bunch? Well, randomization allows us to do that using this noisy data. So we can look at this noisy data and say, okay, here are clusters in the data. Transformation, well, you move the data around in some way that you can't undo and find out the real data, but you can still get exact answers. And then a third approach is anonymization. We generalize the data in a way that you can't really get back and figure out who the individuals are, but you can still figure out the answer to your question. And then a last approach is secure multi-party computation. Here the idea is you carry on a protocol that does your machine learning and gives back the final result without anybody actually ever disclosing their data. Okay. So these are several approaches which enable us to do our machine learning without revealing as much. Okay. So I'm going to go through a little more detail on each of these, give an example. First, data obfuscation, or randomization. Yes?
I'm a little confused about what our goal is. Why do we care how many terrorists there are without knowing who?
Well, we don't know. So at this point, we're just evaluating that model. We want to determine whether that model we developed up here is any good or not. So we want to see, is that a good model? And to do that, we're going to say, out of this large sample of people, how many people does it say are terrorists? If it says a bunch of people are terrorists, then it's probably not a good, very good model, because there's probably not a lot of terrorists there. If it says there's very few, then we can say, okay, well, it's not getting a lot of false alarms. So this is just a very simple example. We're trying to learn one very simple thing. How many people did this return? So this is, like I say, we can do a lot more challenging things, but I picked this just because it's very easy to see. Okay. So with data obfuscation, the idea is we're going to randomly modify data or swap data between records, some sort of controlled modification of the data to hide things we know we want to hide. We're hiding our protected information by modifying the data. Now, there's two problems with this. One, does it really protect the data? How do we know how effective we've been at hiding what we want to hide? And second, can we learn from the results? Well, both of these are challenging issues and can be addressed somewhat separately. This actually was the first paper titled Privacy Preserving Data Mining. Actually, 2 papers came out the same year with exactly the same title. And both did the same thing. They allowed us to privately learn a decision tree, an ID3 decision tree. Except they worked in very different ways. And we'll take a look briefly at one of them, very briefly at the other. So the first one by Rakesh Agarwal and Ramakrishnan Srikant, basically they made the assumption that users are willing to give true values for some data, but for others, well, they don't really want you to know the true value. They'll give you a modified value. So if they're allowed to add random noise to their value, they will give you that information. They did some surveys that suggested that this would actually help us get better data. So the idea is what the user actually provides is going to be their value plus a random, where that random will be chosen from some known distribution. a uniform distribution about some point. We can discuss, there's actually problems with that because you can end up with much less privacy than you think it gives you. Or a Gaussian, standard Gaussian distribution. And they actually showed how to do this for both. So if you think about how we learn a decision tree, let me skip. OK, so if you think about how you would learn a decision tree, what you do is at each point you're going to pick an attribute and split on that attribute and say how many things go to each side. How many of one class go here? How many of one class go here? Well, if we've got enough data and say you add Gaussian noise, you're going to end up with some moving from one side to the other, but about as many should move back. So a naive view of this would just say, well, I'll just learn from this noisy data. And since it's centered around 0, as many things as go, as start giving me the wrong answer, I'll get the same number that would have been wrong that'll give me the right answer. And so I'll still get the same results. And to a large extent, that's true. We can even show that, yes, we can just learn from it and we'll get the right results, except for one problem. You need to pick split points in a decision tree if you're dealing with continuous data. If I'm looking at age, why did you put K? By the way, these blue slides were courtesy of Ramakrishnan and Srikant. If we look at age, maybe there's some very clear split point. We have two very distinct groups. And so when we divide this, we should clearly divide that into those two separate groups, and then decide which class is which group. Well, once we've picked that split point, we can show that you can just learn from the noisy data, and things will average out to give us the right answer. But once you add the noise, you can't see that clear split point anymore. It isn't clear that there's two distinct groups. Well, what they showed is that we can reconstruct that original distribution given the noisy data and the knowledge of the distribution of the noise. We can reconstruct the distribution, but that doesn't mean we can reconstruct the values. We still don't know an individual's actual value, even though we know that there's really two distinct groups in the data. So how is this done? Well, what we really have here is x sub I, the value, plus y sub I, which is the noise. We know the distribution that y sub I comes from. And what we're trying to learn is the distribution that x sub I comes from. So we know two things. We know each of the summed values, and we know the distribution that the y values come from. And by using Bayes' rule, we can actually come up with that distribution. We can actually learn that distribution and still do no better than kind of our original estimate of what the actual value is. So we see if our original distribution is actually way over, well, our estimate for that value may be quite a ways off. And by doing this and combining it for all the points, we can use Bayes' rule to come up with a distribution. I'll actually just give a brief example of how this works. OK, so we have our original data, which we assume is drawn from this distribution, the true distribution. And then we have our values that we receive. and we have our y sub I. Well, what we can say is that using Bayes' rule, we can say that the distribution of that sum, okay, so if we take the distribution of the sum and over the integral of the distribution of the sum at a particular point divided by kind of the distribution over all points, that should eventually converge. We use this to update. So it's an iterative algorithm which basically is maximum likelihood estimation. So what we do is we start with an assumption that x is a uniform distribution, and then we estimate, given a uniform distribution, how well we have done at predicting that. How well that distribution matches the data we actually have. So basically you compare what a uniform distribution would give you with the actual sums you have, and you keep, and from that you get a slightly better distribution. And you keep repeating this until this converges, basically until the distribution that this formula gives you is about the same as the distribution that it gave you last time. And what this does is it allows you to reconstruct. In this case, the yellow is the data I'm seeing, and I'm able to reconstruct the green as the distribution, which is very close to the red. But I don't know which individual is which. One of those red individuals may have jumped way over to the right from the left side to the right side when I see the yellow. Well, I'm going to predict, okay, well maybe they're this green dot in the middle. I'm going to get it way off if I try to predict an individual. Let me skip ahead a little bit. So here's an example where they've looked at data generated from 5 separate functions. And the red line is the accuracy of a decision tree learned using ID3 on the original data. The yellow line is a decision tree learned from the randomized data. And you can see we do a very poor job some of the time. But when we do this reconstruction of the distribution, we're able to do much better.
I'm sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So you're saying you do a much better, it looks like you're doing a worse job.
OK. The green line is the reconstructed accuracy. 100% is perfect accuracy. So the top, and this is a kind of a poor graph because this really isn't a line. These are independent points. So don't worry about the fact that they seem to be connected. It's kind of a strange way of looking at it. But what this is showing us is that for function 2, if we build it on the original data, we get 90% accuracy. If we build it on the noisy data, we get 55% accuracy of our classifier. But if we reconstruct the data, or reconstruct the distribution, and then learn from the original data, but using that reconstructed distribution to pick the right split points, we get 75% accuracy. What's more, as you would expect, the more noise you add, the worse learning from the original data gets, up to a strange anomaly there at a certain point. But hey, once you're down to 50% accuracy on a binary classifier, hey, it's just noise. You can see that things drop off pretty rapidly if you're trying to learn from the noisy data, but using that reconstruction, we can still do fairly well, even with very noisy data. OK. So I'll tell you that this has been developed, clustering techniques, different types of classification techniques, association rules. Lots of methods exist where you take and add noise to the data, and then by doing some tricks in how you learn from the data, you're able to do much better than a naive approach. Okay, a second approach, the data separation approach, the secure multi-party computation. Here, our goal is that only trusted parties see the data. So I already have your data. As long as I don't give it to anybody else, at least you're no worse off than you were before. Now, some of the approaches, well, limited release. Maybe I'll give a trusted machine learner some subset of the data. Better still, I won't even trust them at all. Some of the problems, is that trusted party willing to do the analysis? What do we have to pay them? Can we trust them? Is there a trusted party? And do the results disclose private information? We'll discuss that later. Okay, so the assumptions for this work, data is distributed. Each data set is held by someone who is authorized to see it. But nobody's allowed to see the aggregate data. Nobody can see everything. The idea is that knowing all the data about an individual is going to cause a privacy violation. If I know a few things about you, maybe that's not too bad. If I have a complete profile, I can do all kinds of nasty things. Identity theft is a very simple example. If I know your social security number, I'm not going to be able to do much in terms of identity theft. If I know your social security number, your address, your birth date, I could basically set myself up as you. So the other assumption is, data holders don't want to disclose the data. They give it out, somebody's going to complain to them. They'll get in trouble. Also, they won't collude to violate privacy. Well, if they would, we're already in trouble. So the idea here, do no harm. For those of you who know the Hippocratic Oath. Let's at least not make things any worse than they already are. So here's an example. My health record is split among providers. Hospitals, pharmacies, doctors, insurance company. Each sees a different part of my health record. I'd love to do medical studies that look at all this data. The Food and Drug Administration is currently in the process of developing what's called the Sentinel system, where they're going to look for adverse drug events, bad things happening with drug use, prescription drug use. They'd like to get all this data together. But hey, that just means as soon as somebody breaks into the FDA's data, your medical privacy is gone. So how do we get around this? Well, one way is, typically each of these have agreed not to release the data. Well, the FDA can get around that because they're the government, but a pharmaceutical company trying to do a study, well, they're going to have to get every individual's consent. That's not plausible. But the rules I'm trying to learn, the models I'm trying to build, don't tell anything about individuals. So why don't I just learn the models directly? So here's the gold standard. Here's what we would love to be able to do. We'd love to be able to say there is a trusted third party. We want this knowledge. The best would be magically get it, but okay, we don't have magic. So let's assume there is a trusted party that we give our data to, and they give us back the knowledge that we want. So This would be beautiful if we could do this. Now the problem is there's this trusted third party that has all this data, has all this knowledge. Well, how can we make sure that we trust them? Well, there's one way. That's probably the only safe way. Because eventually somebody's going to break into that trusted party's systems. So the solution is to learn the data without ever revealing anything to that trusted party. And secure multi-party computation proved that it can be done. So the idea, we want to compute a function when each party has some of the inputs, and we don't want to reveal that. Now, actually, I saw this when I was a graduate student. Keep your eyes open to things that aren't in your field. You know, this theoretician, probabilistic algorithm, he wasn't somebody I paid much attention to. That was completely outside my field. I remember seeing the talk. If I'd paid closer attention to it, I might have been the first person to write privacy-preserving data mining paper. If you look at the first privacy-preserving data mining paper, it cites a paper of mine which pointed out that this is a problem. I saw the problem. Unfortunately, I hadn't paid close enough attention to see the solution. So pay attention to everything going on around you as a student. There may be something that comes in handy later. So the idea behind this was, if we can represent a function as a circuit, which for those of you who think back a while, you realize that covers everything we typically think of as computable. What he showed was we can securely compute each gate with the outcome of that being shared, randomly split between the parties. Think of it, the gate has the wire that comes out has a 1 or 0 on it. Well, each of us gets a 1 or 0, and if we exclusive OR those, we get the true result. But which of us gets which part of that is completely random. He showed how we could do this. And then it was later extended to work for multiple parties. The problem is, the problem with this approach is, for a lot of the machine learning techniques, you really can't build one of these circuits unless it gets really, really big. And that just takes much too long to compute. OK, so what does security in this mean? Well, the idea, nobody sees anything but their own input and the results. That's what you would like to have. Unfortunately, you're going to share more information in order to compute the result. But what you're going to do is show that there is a polynomial time simulator such that given your own input and the result you get from this function, the simulator can simulate the view you actually saw when you ran the protocol. And we'll see a very simple example of what this means, so don't worry about it if it doesn't make sense. And we can prove that there's various models for an adversary in this. Semi-honest model, which will actually prove something today, and that's where this definition works. Parties will follow the protocol, but they're going to remember the intermediate exchanges. Things sit in a backup or in a log file. And you show that from those log files, you can't actually learn anything beyond the final result. Malicious, they could even cheat, not follow the protocol. And then there's an intermediate model, which the malicious often turns out to be very difficult to achieve. Wei Zhang, who's at Missouri Science and Technology, came up with a model, accountable computing. The idea is it's semi-honest, except after the fact, you can prove that you were semi-honest. You can prove that you followed the protocol. If someone cheats, they might learn something they're not supposed to, but they're no longer able to prove that they didn't cheat. So when something goes wrong, data is disclosed, you go out and prove you didn't cheat to show that you weren't the one who disclosed the data. OK, so here's an example of a very simple secure multi-party computation protocol. 4 of us, the missing person's the one taking the picture, we're going up to Borges Hospital for a project we're dealing with. We're working with some data coming from the hospital. Now, this has nothing to do with the data from the hospital, although it is personal health-related data that we're dealing with. The problem is, when you're taking one of these small airplanes, there's a limit to how much weight they can carry. So we need to know, or I needed to know, is the plane going to be within the weight limit? I basically need to know how much weight we're putting into that plane. But I've been taught it's not nice to ask a lady her weight. So I would like to learn the sum of the weights without actually learning any individual's weight. Well, here's the solution. And to my knowledge, I am the only person who has used a secure multi-party computation protocol to solve a safety-critical problem. But I did. Here it is. I took my weight, and I added a random number to it. I then emailed that to Mamorthy. So I took that weight and the random number. There's actually the number I put in the email. And I emailed that off to Mamorthy with instructions to add his weight to it and send the sum on to Xinyang. So you're going to see my view of this protocol. I know that he added his weight to it, but I don't know what his weight is. So I have no idea. I don't know what number he sent off to her. So he sent some number to her. She added her weight to it, sent that number off to Professor Cleveland, who added his weight and sent the result back to me. Now, have I learned anything about, have I learned Xinyang's weight from this? What have I learned? I learned the sum of the weights. Actually, if I take my 75 and the minus 387, I can figure out the sum of their 3 weights. Or if I just subtract the random number, I get the sum of the weights. That's my final goal. OK, so here's an interesting thing about this. This allows us to go through a proof. I said that simulation, that simulation of the view. Well, my view of this protocol, I saw 2 things. Well, actually, I knew that original minus 387. I knew my weight, and I knew the final number that came back. Well, I'd like to be able to simulate that without ever getting that final number back. How do I do that? Well, what is the simulator allowed to know? It's allowed to know the sum of the weights. Now that should be a WB, I guess, at the end, shouldn't it? So it's allowed to know the sum of the weights, the final result. So if it takes that sum, and I'm trying to figure out this final number that I got back, well, that is, R plus the sum of the weights. Well, the idea is that the view should be the distribution of this view should be indistinguishable from the distribution of the real views. if I ran this protocol again, I'd choose a different random number, and I'd get a different sum. But across many runs of it, the simulator can do the same thing. It can take the sum of the weights, add the random number, and give me the final result. Well, actually, it generates a random number, adds the sum of the weights. That tells me what Professor Cleveland sent me. And across many runs, the distribution I'll get would be the same as the actual distribution in running this protocol. So I'm able to simulate that message I'm receiving. That's how we prove that this is secure. I tried this later with running some undergrads. And they said they sent the complete message, including the number I sent and their added number, and sent that on. And so I ended up with a whole bunch of numbers. I don't think they understood how this was supposed to work. But this first time, we got the correct result, but I also violated privacy. This time, the first time, though, it worked. OK. So I mentioned a second approach, decision tree. Oh, yes, you had a question.
So one issue with that, though, is if any of the other two people tell you their weight, that helps you get the other person's weight.
Yeah. It's not secure from collusion. There is a multi-round protocol where basically you do it, different randoms, you send them to different people in different orders, where you can do this and be safe from collusion. Yeah. So there is a way you can extend this to deal with that. It's fairly straightforward. I'm sure if you think about it for a while, you'll see it. But hey, this was just a proof that it could be done. I didn't worry about people colluding. OK. So the other 2000 paper called Privacy Preserving Data Mining was, again, let's learn an ID3 decision tree. In this case, two parties each held half the data. And we wanted to learn this. I'm not going to go into details on how this was done, because it's actually fairly complicated from a cryptographic point of view, but not very interesting from a machine learning point of view. Key assumptions: semi-harness protocol, two parties, and it was an approximation of ID3, basically calculating information gain across two parties without revealing anything from either one. And they showed how to efficiently approximate this using this cryptographic protocol. But I'll show a simpler one, which is how we can learn some of this information for computing association rules. The idea of an association rule is I have transactions. Market basket is the initial example. Things that people purchase together. And I'd like to learn that if they purchase A and B together, then they're likely to purchase C. There's fast algorithms for doing this. The basic idea is that for A and B implies C to be frequent, in order for this to happen in enough people that it's worth running a marketing campaign based on it, each of the subsets have to be frequent. So I find the subsets first that are frequent, and then I use this to build the larger sets that are frequent. Well, what we showed is that we can also do this without actually having to reveal the data. And this is a cryptographic protocol using a technique known as commutative encryption. The idea behind this, so the idea behind commutative encryption is that if you encrypt something with your key and you give it to me and I encrypt it with my key, then it doesn't matter that would be exactly the same as if I took the same thing and first encrypted it with my key and then gave it to you and you encrypted with your key. Actually, a lot of commutative techniques, RSA is a commutative encryption technique. So this is very doable. So the idea behind how this works, I'll show you a quick example, is what we're first going to do is say, we're going to note that if something is frequent globally, it has to be frequent at least one of these sites. If it doesn't occur in 5%, if it occurs in 5% of the data, that can't happen if it's only 4% at each site. So what we do is we each take the things that are frequent at our site and we encrypt them. And then we pass it to the next site. What do they see? An encrypted value. They don't have the key to decrypt it. They don't know what it is. They encrypt with their key. And the third encrypts. Now we can give this all to a single site. And even though the encryption order is different, they can say, OK, let's get rid of that duplicate. We see it's a duplicate, but we don't know what it is. And done right, you don't even know if it's, if it's something that was yours or not, which one is which. And then we remove our encryption, so forth, get back, and now we come up with things that we know are frequent at least one site, but we don't know which site. And now we can use secure sum to determine, are they frequent globally? So I'm going to skip through that, given that we're running late on time here. We already talked about secure sum. So using this, we're able to learn something without revealing individual data. Using a similar technique, we can actually put data from two different types of data about the same individual together. Vertical partitioning, we have two different types of data about the same set of individuals. We'd like to combine this and learn from it, but we don't actually want to reveal it. And very similar techniques can be used to solve this problem. So I'm not going to go into details on that. I'm going to kind of wrap up with a few issues. First, some successes we've had. Numerous machine learning tasks solved in both the secure multi-party computation model, the obfuscation, transformation models. A lot of things that we can do. So I'd claim wonderful success here. Enough that it got our book translated into Japanese. I also claim it's a failure. Why? Nobody wants to invest in it. People are willing to pay for privacy. How much are they willing to pay? Turns out it's pennies. The data is worth a lot more exposed to the people who have it than the cost of building this technology. What are the incentives? Cost from disclosure, customer demands, legal requirements, better value from data. Well, you don't get better value from the data than you would just looking at the raw data. The one possible incentive we have is, well, maybe I don't have to work so hard to protect the data if I don't see it. Nobody's felt that's worth it. This reduced risk of unintentional disclosure. If we had more time, I could show you what that really is, what that cost is, and why it's not enough. There are some other things we can do. There's other types of sensitive data which people are willing to pay more to protect. Trade secrets, pricing, capabilities, intelligence information, customer information. These are things that people are willing to pay to protect. And so if you're looking at privacy technology in machine learning, you might want to look at applications in this area. That's more likely to get corporate funding anyway. Okay, so, oops, that wasn't quite as far ahead as I wanted to skip to. So some of the issues, obfuscation or randomization, some of the problems there, how much is enough? It's dependent on the adversary, the sensitivity of the data, the individual. What about correlated values? It turns out that if I randomize two different values, it's very easy to break that randomization and determine the original values for both. And is there a legal basis for this? What I didn't have time to go into is that legally, it's all about individually identifiable data. If I take individually identifiable data but mess up the actual values, is that still protected or not? That's kind of unexplored. A second approach is anonymization. The goal here is that data is not individually identifiable and therefore exempt from the privacy laws. So you remove identifiers, and also some things you would generalize. So like, you might have zip code instead of full address. And by this, you still can learn from it, but it's no longer individually identifiable. As it turns out, that's, oh, come on. That's still not very clear. There's still some issues in learning from generalized data, just as there were with learning from randomized data that are yet to be solved. And then here's a last thing which has come up, which has some interesting implications. There's a new privacy definition, differential privacy. The idea is what we're going to do is we're going to take, and you're not going to get access to the data in its original form. You're going to be allowed to get some sort of information from the database. But it's randomized. The result you get is randomized. It may be I ask a query of the database, or it may be I ask to see the data. And what you get back has noise added to it. But the way we're going to say it's enough noise is we're going to say if I took and created a second database, which is a copy, but I removed an individual from it, I shouldn't be able to tell these two apart. And that should hold for any two database, or for any database D1 and any individual that I remove. I've added enough noise to protect any possible database and any possible individual being removed. Within some multiplicative factor. This is true. Basically, the idea is that what I see is likely to be a particular result with some probability. And within some factor for D2, I'm likely to see the same outcome. This is nice because basically what it's telling me is for any two individuals, as an individual, I might have been removed from that database and you wouldn't be able to tell it apart. So from whatever you're asking the database, what are you learning about an individual? No matter what individual they were, you can't even tell whether they're there or not. So how are you learning about an individual? Interesting from a machine learning point of view because we can talk about the model we learn from the data and say, is that model we learn from the data satisfy, is it differentially private? If it is, then we can make a strong claim that the model we've learned is not revealing private information. Okay, one of the difficulties with, it's easy enough to do this. Turns out there's a general technique which allows us to do this. A little difficulty. You have to know all possible databases. Well, not just your own data. Some issues with this. How do you estimate the sensitivity without knowing the whole universe? Can you do this safely? What's the right setting for epsilon? It turns out it's not obvious. That it's very dependent on a whole lot of things. If you think of your goal is not individually identifiable, it's not clear how to set that e to the epsilon parameter. Other work we've got going on is graph structured data. Opens up a whole new slew of problems that just don't respond well to some of the normal techniques. Okay, last thing I'd like to mention is discrimination discovery with respect to privacy. This is kind of turning on its head. We're saying that our goal is to make sure that the learned model doesn't do something bad, even if it's not using private data. So as an example, in the US, using race to, say, determine whether someone qualifies for a mortgage loan is not allowed. Well, what happens if you don't use race, but you end up with a classifier which essentially discriminates against people based on race? Well, you're not using race. That's okay, right? But it turns out that's not true. There's a thing known as mortgage redlining that was done, which is they used neighborhoods. And they said, we won't give loans in these neighborhoods. There's a high risk of default. Well, it turned out that those were minority neighborhoods. This was outlawed because it disproportionately impacted minorities, even though the race was not being used. This is some work that's just come out. Won a best demo at SIGMOD 2010, which used learning associations to determine when a protected variable was unfairly impacted by a rule. So this is an interesting, using machine learning to determine whether your machine learning is acceptable. Okay. One last thing I will leave you with, if I can get to it, is fair information practices. Anytime you're doing something with machine learning techniques, you want to keep these in mind. When you're using private data, you want to provide notice. That means people need to be aware of what is being done with their data. You want to give people a choice. You don't use people's private data unless they have given you consent. These first two come out a term called informed consent. And what does informed consent mean? How many of you use Gmail? How many of you know what sort of things they do with the email you send? You consented to their doing it when you signed up. Would you call that informed consent? How many people would say they gave informed consent? I see one person raise their hand. Somebody spent a couple hours reading through the fine print.
Well, I knew that.
Yeah, you felt that was sufficient, knowing that you looked at that enough to know they could do pretty much anything they wanted with your data. Yeah. I will give you an example of informed consent. This is someone who was from Germany, went to Taiwan, and spent some time in Taiwan, and they accessed their Yahoo account. They got an email from Yahoo saying, we noticed that you have been using your Yahoo account from Taiwan. If we move your data to our Taiwanese servers, we will be able to provide you with the following localized services, and we will be able to give you better performance. However, your data is currently protected by German data protection laws. If we move it to the Taiwanese servers, it will now be subject to Taiwanese law, which may allow for government access to that data, or other ways of people obtaining access to that data which are not permitted under German law. Given this, if you would like us to move the data to the Taiwanese servers, please reply to this email. If we do not hear from you, we won't. I would claim that that is informed consent. They've told you what you get and what the risks are in real-world terms, and asked for your consent. Compare that with the typical privacy policy you look at, where read all this fine print. If you click on this link, you can see all the fine print. Okay. Access, participation. You ought to be able to see your data. You ought to know what they've maintained about you. Integrity and security. You need to make sure that you keep the data, that the data is correct, and that you protect it. And enforcement and redress. If something goes wrong, there should be a way for a person to correct it and be protected against the damage that could ensue. These are fair information practices. This doesn't have the force of law, but there's some good things to keep in mind if you're doing anything involving private data. Okay. Does anybody have any questions, comments on this? I think I remember 6 o'clock was supposed to be the time I finished, which we're about on, but yeah, you had a...
Yeah, I have a question. One thing that doesn't ensure my privacy, but I could use is, for instance, to know who is actually looking at my data.
Yeah.
And I never hear anything about that. But I could ask to have a log, and if I really want to, I can
Yeah. That is an example. That is an example of who has accessed your data is a very interesting thing you'd like to have. Not only what is the data, but who's accessed it. With some laws, you actually are given the right to do that. Whether somebody would be able to actually give you that information, I have my doubts. There's a lot of cases, particularly in Europe, where you have certain rights with respect to personal data about you that are not handled well. So for example, you can ask someone to delete your personal data. And I know someone who did that with a bank. Gotten so fed up with them that he asked them to delete the data about him, as was required by law. Several years later, the bank offered a really good deal. He went back in and gave them another try. He gave them his ID number and name and such. And they popped up and said, "Oh, so-and-so, it's good to have you back. We see you haven't been with us since," Great grounds for a lawsuit. He didn't, unfortunately, I think unfortunately, he didn't pursue it. But yeah, so there is what places are required to do and what they actually do often. And so yes, often you are given the right to see who has accessed your data. It can be difficult to actually exercise that right. Any other questions, comments? Yeah.
Following up on that, would the people accessing your data, would they not want people to know that they're accessing the data?
Yeah, that's an interesting quandary. One person's private data may be what another person should be allowed to get access to. Is my record of what I've accessed private? I think yes. But if I'm accessing data about someone else, should they be allowed to know that? That can be actually, had in. There are cases where this comes up. I know of someone who was a psychiatrist dealing with a clinic, it was in the legal system, basically mental health in the legal system. And it was a very interesting quandary of who should be allowed, when caller ID came in. Should he be able to call someone? Someone would call in. The way this worked is someone would call in with a problem, and the operator would call the psychiatrist, who would call the person back. This was done to protect the psychiatrist from rather volatile and potentially dangerous patients. Caller ID was an interesting problem with this, because now all of a sudden when you call back, they could find out who you were. This is why you have the ability to block caller ID. And why you have the ability to say you will block calls from people who block caller ID. Lots of, it's giving you that choice on both sides. Yeah, any?
One thing I didn't see a lot about was, well, I guess you sort of started by talking about policies and then going, that's too complicated. But maybe there's some more work to be done there. It's just a thought that I would
yeah, with respect to privacy, what it means, what should be disclosed, what shouldn't. Yes, there's a lot, and there's actually some interesting challenges in machine learning there. So, for example, simply, what does it mean for data to be individually identifiable? The more information we're able to learn, the more we can find out that things we thought weren't individually identifiable are. How do we measure this? How do we talk about this? How do we limit this? Is certainly an interesting challenge, and is a whole another hour talk. Just to lay out some of the problems and challenges. So yes, that is very much a thing to be worked out from this point of view. Other comments? Questions? Like I say, there's a lot of the slides I sent around have quite a bit of information that we didn't get time to cover, including some brief overviews of some of the laws governing privacy, some more details on some of these techniques. So there's, and like I say, if you're interested in this, please feel free to come talk to me. I'll be around the rest of this week, and you can probably track me down once in a while during breaks or lunch hours. So feel free to send me an email, and we can try to talk about this. Well, before I turn everybody loose, do we have any announcements before? Okay. Okay. So we have a leader for people who want to go out and do something and have some fun. And then we also have those of us who are trying to make the ICDM deadline. So anyway, have a good evening. Have a good rest of the summer school.